Hi everybody, Dana Litwin here again, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips for Leaders of Volunteers. Last week we talked about board basics, building a board development, and kind of a related topic this week, really an evergreen topic, which is forming a friends of, or if your organization, especially a government agency or a private foundation, already has a friends of, then how do you co-manage volunteers and campaigns and align your marketing together? So kind of looking at this through a volunteer engagement lens. A Friends of organization, at least here in the USA, and of course your tax laws and business formation laws are going to be different in different parts of the world, but essentially a Friends of organization is a formal or informal group. It might have its own nonprofit 501(c) status. It might be just kind of ad hoc and formed for a specific project, but generally Friends of organizations are created or formed to support the work of an organization that either doesn't have the capacity to do fundraising or they're not really allowed to do their own fundraising. And here in the States, that typically means a government agency. So that could be a school district or Parks and Rec or, Friends of the Firefighters, things like that. There's also a very legally distinct category of Friends of wherein foundations can support charities that are in other countries. And so I'll link to resources for all these kinds of legal or informal, formal ways to have a Friends of organization. But just understand that if you're talking about a private foundation wanting to contribute to an international charity organization, that it typically means setting up a Friends of is like a local chapter in the USA or in Canada that has its own kind of distinct legal definition. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kind of more localized or within your own country Friends of, because it's a little less complicated, and quite frankly it happens much more often, especially with school districts and park districts, land trusts, things like that. So the main thing with a Friends of, especially if you're starting it from the ground up, is to really identify what is the organizational structure going to be that's going to best serve the other agency or entity or the project or the specific campaign you're fundraising for. And even if it's informal, there should at the very least be some sort of very clear mission and structure, like a steering committee, working committees, who's in charge, who's chairing those committees, and what are everyone's specific roles. And very often Friends of are entirely volunteer-run organizations, so that's another reason it's good to talk about it as leaders of volunteers. But identify a group that's willing to potentially take your Friends of organization under its wing as a fiscal sponsor. So there may be a larger nonprofit that can serve as a fiscal sponsor, and sometimes Friends of organizations form into nonprofits to become a fiscal agent for more informal or ad hoc fundraising campaigns, promotional campaigns for free public services, things like that. So there can just, make sure you understand and choose the correct type of organizational structure when you're building up a Friends of. It takes a lot of time to get 501(c) exempt nonprofit status in the US, and it takes a lot of money to do that. So that's why sometimes it's easier to find a fiscal sponsor and have a kind of legally informal or ad hoc organization, but still have clear roles, setting and meeting expectations of everyone involved, of what's expected of their time, what kind of experience or background or talent you're looking for, not just warm bodies. So sometimes you do need to find a fiscal sponsor. I'll put some resources in the video description of where you might find fiscal sponsors to use an ad hoc or informal Friends of organization, like city planning commissions and things like that. Even if your group doesn't want to or isn't going to form as an official nonprofit, as that kind of legal entity, it's still very, very good idea to align with the government agency or the private foundation or the agency that you're most closely aligned with. You really want to have very clear communication, maybe even set up a communication plan so that there are good boundaries between when someone is volunteering with, say, the Parks and Rec department and working for them, and versus a Friends of organization that might be fundraising or trying to put something on the ballot, where you can't cross the streams legally between a government entity campaigning and a Friends of campaigning to help a ballot measure, fundraising measure, or just soliciting funds for a government agency. So whatever that relationship is of the Friends of, make sure that that communication is really clear, that all of your marketing material and branding material lines up just enough that people know you're distinct entities, but that you're working towards a common goal, especially when you're doing a fundraising campaign. And this can be little tiny projects, they can be long-term projects, they can be something that just happens in bond measure, ballot measure, election cycles. So Friends of can exist from now until forever as a support mechanism for, again, a government agency or a private foundation, or they can just, pop up and be, again, ad hoc but well organized for a specific project or campaign. Any fiscal sponsor will probably require you to have a lot of these structures and accountability measures or budget or elect treasurer or something in place anyway, just so that you are, as a Friends of organization or a leader starting that Friends of, that you are accountable to the money that is going in and out. You do share the same goals as the agency you're working with, so avoid kind of search engine competition. So again, have things aligned, but just distinct enough that people can tell you're two different agencies working together towards the same thing. And you also want to create a seamless experience of donating to the Friends of for your donors and supporters and volunteers. It's crucial that a fundraising team in the Friends of stays up to date with what the agency's doing, what their beneficiary agency's latest initiatives are, and to make sure that that messaging between both agencies is consistent. That's a lot easier said than done. I've done things like this with government agencies where the special district cannot, as a government agency, fundraise or support any political candidate or measure, and Friends of or nonprofits with similarly aligned conservation missions would set up, volunteer phone banks for campaigning, for ballot measures, for funding measures, for bond measures, things like that. So this is where we get into that volunteer engagement, volunteer management piece that can be really tricky. I had a very careful messaging training with the government agency, the special districts volunteers, saying, if you as a private citizen wish to go phone bank, canvass, fundraise with our Friends of, these are the boundaries that you have to observe. And in that case, it happened to be that you can't wear anything of your volunteer uniform or staff uniform with the agency. If you go to do that, you can't identify yourself as associated with that government agency or staff working there, but you can do that. You can choose to split your hours and support these causes with a common goal. Now, with government agencies, again, in the States, it's pretty tight regulations about where those boundaries are. That may be different in a country or region where you are in the world, but it is important no matter where you are in the world, if you're doing a Friends of organization, whether it's its own nonprofit or an informal organization, or it's fiscally sponsored by a different nonprofit, that your volunteers have that boundary training, that messaging training where it's a consistent message, but it's phrased distinctly. Typically, these government agencies, we can educate the public about our mission, but we can't promote anything specifically. And then the Friends of can talk specifically about a campaign or use fundraising language. The other thing is don't double dip the volunteer hours. So if you are working closely with a Friends of or you're forming one, make sure that really great best practices for volunteer management, record keeping, hours tracking, that's in place for the Friends of, and it's not only happening on the other agency side, on the beneficiary agency side. So if the phone bank hours, after hours, and someone's free time different from their volunteer or staff shift with the beneficiary agency, that's counted by that Friends of organization, especially if they're writing grants or, again, other proposals or doing fundraising campaigns that are specific to a shared goal, and that whatever volunteer hours that person or staff hours that person is doing with the beneficiary agency, that those are kept completely separate and you're not counting one for the other as you calculate volunteer hours for grant making for either organization. It's also important to drop the idea of poaching and to really, sharing is caring with volunteers with those guardrails and those specific boundaries, messaging training, communication training that is in place. But if you have a well-run Friends of organization, it's a fantastic way to fundraise for, things that are underfunded as government agencies, which unfortunately is all too common here in the USA. And let me know in the comments how it works if you're in a different part of the world. How do Friends of work there? Is there a different legal structure? Do they function differently? Or is it pretty close to the same as it is here in the States and Canada? So I hope you enjoy these Tuesday tips. Let me know if you have any other ideas for topics that you want to hear about, or if you want to share your own wisdom as a leader of volunteers with the Priceless Advice and Tuesday Tips audience on my channel. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Happy Halloween for those who are celebrating, and we'll see you next time with more Tuesday Tips. Take care.